Baseball season is finally upon us as pitchers and catchers report to camp today. Spring training is here. On the show, we will discuss which players have the most to prove in camp this season. Let's get into it on this edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment matter more by visiting FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Now, which players have the most to prove in camp this season? Looking over the roster, obviously you have the guys that you know will make the team, you know will have a chance to play every day to start the season, the starting pitchers who will get a couple turns in the rotation, guys that really don't have anything to worry about in spring other than getting ready. Your Justin Verlander, Max Scherzers of the world, Jose Quintana, although he'll be in the WBC. There's a lot of different pitchers. Kodai Senga has a lot to prove, but I don't know how much of that in spring training. Obviously, throughout the season, that's going to be big for him, but early on, we know he's going to be in the starting rotation. Lindor, McNeil, Alonso, Marte, Nimmo, even Canna to a certain extent, Eduardo Escobar. These are guys where spring training, for the most part, doesn't matter. Today, we're focusing in on the guys where spring training really does matter, where they have a roster spot in jeopardy, or even, are in a point in their careers where, when it comes to prospects, they're trying to break through. When it comes to some aging players, they're trying to hang on. So the first couple players that we're discussing here, it's position players, and it's both ends of the spectrum. First name we have to mention is Darin Ruf. Darin Ruf has way more to prove this spring training than I think most veterans do around baseball that are under a guaranteed contract, $3 million. But, he's a big DFA risk. I mean, I don't think anybody would bat an eye if we're, a week before opening day and we find out the Mets have released Darin Ruf. He was that bad last season, but when you are going into camp and he's competing with prospects and Danny Mendick and whatever else, you could look at Tim LeCastro and non-roster signing, Darin Ruf has the inside edge at the job right now. I mean, I would say that, he's probably the betting favorite to grab that last spot on the bench, but it's a very thin margin. I would probably take the field over him, but you never really know here. I mean, he does complement what's left on the roster, his ability to play first base, to back up Pete, to play a corner outfield spot, to theoretically do what he's done in his career, which is hit left-handed pitching. That is a skill set that the Mets could utilize. So Darin Ruf, if he goes out in camp and he still just feels the pressure of the New York Mets uniform as a guy where it really did feel like he sort of had a yips type of situation at the end of the season there, where he just, for whatever reason, was in his head so much he could not get the job done. And you say what you want about it being overblown sometimes playing in New York. Darin Ruf is an example where it was not overblown. Playing in that big market seemed to be a lot for him. So, obviously it's not a big market in the Grapefruit League, but you're still wearing that Mets uniform. There's still the New York media there. How is he going to handle it? Is he going to go out and have a great spring? Because if he does, all right, well, he's on the roster. If he goes out and he doesn't get a hit and he strikes out in 2/3 of the at-bats, they might just look at Darin Ruf and say, you know what, we got to cut our losses. So Darin Ruf might have more to prove than any hitter in camp, which is crazy to say for a guy that's been around as long as he has. You go over to Danny Mendick. For him, I think it's proving health just as much as performance. He had a nice season with the White Sox, signed in by the Mets on a contract that probably not many other teams would be willing to go to, giving him $1 million guaranteed, but it was a good depth bought by Steve Cohen, and now you have this guy that could be in Syracuse. he could be on the injured list. We really don't know. He's coming off a torn ACL. I referenced multiple times in this show an interview he did with Metzmerized and Matthew Brownstein, where he did say he thinks he's going to be ready for opening day. So if he is, we're going to see him in some spring training action. What's he going to look like? What's the bat look like? What positions does he play? In some ways, he kind of has a similar skill set to Louis Guillorme when it comes to positional flexibility. But I think Guillorme's spot on this roster is pretty locked in. Do they want two guys like that, having a lefty and a righty? I think that you can make an argument that if Danny Mendick is healthy, he brings a lot more to your bench than Darin Ruf does. So those are two veterans that I think have a lot to prove in camp. Obviously, you have the other names that are in camp, the non-roster signings, the Tim LeCastro, the Abraham Amante. We'll talk about non-roster signings at some point, probably next week. But those guys aren't going to a camp with a real clear shot at making the team. Ruf and Mendick are. Now we look over at the other position players that have a lot to prove, and it's the kids. It's Alvarez, it's Baty, it's Vientos. We have discussed them ad nauseum. For Alvarez, it's can you catch? I think the hitting is going to be hard for him to hit on the roster. I don't think that even a torrid spring gets Alvarez on this team to start. I think he's going to be in Syracuse to begin the year. I really believe that. But can you show enough defensively working with these pitchers, right? I mean, this is pitchers and catchers report. Alvarez is already there. This is his time to show that he has the maturity and the abilities to command a big league staff, or at least has the makings of it, where a little more fine-tuning in Syracuse and in a couple of months into the season, the Mets can count him. So he's got a lot to prove that way. For Brett Baty and Mark Vientos, there's still the defensive questions they have to prove. Can they field a position? Can they play third base? Vientos, it's seeming less and less likely, but you can't count him out. Still a young enough athlete that if he worked really hard this spring, maybe he can play at least close to average third base. And Baty, the reason why he was given that promotion before Vientos last year was partially because of the glove. So can he continue to show that? And what's the back going to look like for those two guys? That's really something that I think we'll have our eyes on. These are players that have a lot of pressure to go out and perform right now. And the last guy I want to mention is Ronnie Mauricio. Coming off an amazing Dominican Winter League experience, can he turn some heads in camp? Not necessarily to make the team, but maybe change the perception of what he is as a player to some of the organization that might be as high on Ronnie Mauricio anymore, just based on what he's done in the minor leagues, the bad swing decisions, the chase rates that are just astronomical, the strikeout rates. He does have some power to dream on. We saw him performing at an MVP level in the Dominican Winter League. Obviously, that is a much different level of competition than Major League Baseball, but it's not too much different to what you're seeing in the minor leagues. So if he can take that, have a good spring, turn some heads now, have a great season in Syracuse, you never know where Ronnie Mauricio could finish this season. So those are obviously the four most notable Mets prospects, but those are the guys that really have a lot to prove. And then, the other guy that is in camp right now is Alex Ramirez. Now, how long will he stay in camp? Probably not too long. Still far away from the big leagues, but it's always good when you see that top-level prospect get a little bit of run. You see him make a cameo in a spring training game, and you can look out and say, oh, that's maybe the future center fielder of the Mets in a couple of years. So those are the notables to discuss when it comes to the position players, but there is a lot of pitchers with a lot to prove. We'll get to that in just a minute. First, though, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The midway point of the NBA season is here. Now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, it's secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers to three-pointers drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. Also, with the MLB season upon us, I'm already looking at MLB future bets. Could Pete Alonso win an MVP? Will Justin Verlander repeat as the Cy Young, but on the National League side? Those are things you can find at FanDuel as well. So don't miss a chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment matter more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Now, going into camp, you could say that the Mets starting rotation is set, but that does not mean that there's no starting pitchers with something to prove. You know, Justin Verlander, Max Scherzer, Kodai Senga, they're all going to be in the rotation, as is Carlos Carrasco and Jose Quintana. But I do think Carlos Carrasco has a little something to prove. In spring training, obviously, I don't think he's going to lose his job, but David Peterson had a really nice season. I am extremely high on David Peterson. If you've been listening to this show throughout the offseason, I think that there's a chance that David Peterson, given the exact same sample size, could be a better starting pitcher this year than both Carrasco and Quintana. So, again, that's more about how I am on Peterson as opposed to how low I could potentially be on Carrasco and Quintana. I think both of those guys are the type of pitchers that, will get you some innings eaten. They're going to go deep into games. They're going to pitch to, bare minimum, I think, sub 4.5 ERA. That's on the high end. Best case you're getting, a low 3 ERA. And it could be anywhere within that range depending on the season they have and the way things are going for them. So I think those are MLB veterans you can count on. And the Mets are going to need at least 6 starters. So it's fine to have David Peterson representing depth or even to potentially be that swingman that Trevor Williams was last year. But in camp, David Peterson looks absolutely awesome and Carlos Carrasco can't get it out. There's going to be something to be said about that. So I do think Carrasco's a little bit to prove, and with that, David Peterson does as well. Can he, take what he did last season, build upon it, and look even better this year? Beyond that, Tylor Megill has a ton to prove. His season last year was colored by injuries. I think the Mets know that. I don't think the Mets are looking at the bloated ERA and thinking that this guy can't pitch anymore. He was amazing in April. He started to have some issues coming into May. He struggled in his last few starts before the IL, came back, struggled again, hit the IL again, came back in the bullpen. He can't judge his season based on numbers, but also he's now has to prove the health. He has to prove that he can find a role on this team. Does he want to just be a starting pitcher? Do the Mets just want to put him as a starting pitcher and have him sit in AAA as depth? I believe that is where things are trending here. But maybe Tylor Megill is the option to replace Trevor Williams. So he's got a lot that he has to show in camp, as does Joey Lucchesi, also coming off injury. For Lucchesi, it's Tommy John. He missed all of last year, but was throwing down the stretch here. So, is he going to be completely healthy, ready to go? Could he be Trevor Williams this year? Could he grab that last spot in the bullpen? Does he even have a chance to be an additional lefty as far as getting left-handed hitters out? What's that curve looking like? Does he have a good secondary pitch to go off of? Obviously, a curve is more of a secondary pitch, but the way he throws it, it's more his primary offering. It's the pitch that really is his bread and butter. What else is he going to throw with it? Is it a fastball? Is it a sinker? What's that pitch looking like in camp? So Joey Lucchesi is another guy that I think goes into spring training looking to make a name for himself again. And then a few other guys to look at. Eliezer Hernandez is apparently going to be the designated pitcher in the WBC, so I don't know how much that pulls him from Mets camp, but he's the guy that's new to the organization that's trying to prove that he can be starter at depth. And there's Jose Butto. Jose Butto had a really nice season last year when he was in Syracuse after making his one-game debut with the Mets. He pitched very, very well, likely to be atop that rotation in Syracuse again, maybe with a guy like a Megill or a Lucchesi. But Butto, he is at this point in his career where he is trying to claw his way to some service time, and spring training is a big time to do that for those guys. So obviously there's a lot of pitchers who are in camp right now that are looking to make a name for themselves. But when it comes to the starters, Carrasco, I think, has to just show that he's ready for a good, healthy season. I think Peterson and Megill are at that point in their careers where they're trying to stay on the MLB roster. And Lucchesi is in that boat as well, trying to show, coming off Tommy John, that he's ready. And Butto is a prospect that I think doesn't have the highest ceiling, but the floor is good enough that I would not be surprised at all if we saw 75 innings out of Budo at the MLB level this year. It's certainly a distinct possibility. But that is all when it comes to starters. There's also a lot of relievers in camp that has something to prove. I'll highlight a few of them after a quick word from our sponsors. When we look at the Mets bullpen, similar to the rotation, there's 5 arms that you pretty much know are going to be there. Edwin Diaz, Adam Ottavino, David Robertson, Brooks Raley, and Drew Smith. Now, of those names, you have Diaz, Ottavino, and Raley all competing in the World Baseball Classic. So that clears up innings for the rest of the pitchers in camp. Robertson, Smith will be there. You got 10 non-roster invites, including Tommy Hunter as the most notable name. And then you got a bunch of other arms that are trying to make this team. Jeff Brigham, he's got something to prove. New organization. I've spotlighted him in the past. Great slider. I think he makes this bullpen, but he's got to go and have a good camp to do that. John Curtis, coming off an injury last year. The Mets have hung on to him for a long time to see what this guy can do. What does he look like in camp? Zach Green. Zach Green's a Rule 5 draft pick. He's got to prove himself all season long to stay with the Mets and stay on the MLB roster and get that year of service time. So he's coming into camp trying to make sure that one of these other guys doesn't grab that job that he has the inside track to. We got Bryce Montes de Oca. I think that there's a chance that you're looking up in July and Bryce Montes de Oca is a serious contributor in this Mets bullpen. I had a show, my new podcast, Who's Better Baseball, with Jack McMullen. We were comparing the Mets to the Braves, and we were going through bullpens, and Jack is a guy that he is a minor league play-by-play announcer. He's big on college baseball. He knows pretty much all you could want about all of the prospects around the game, and he, personally made note of Montes de Oca. He actually ended the show with that. It was kind of a random way to end. We had just spent whatever it was, 30 minutes comparing the starting lineups, Mets and Braves, the rotations, the bullpen, and we're discussing all the stars, Matt Olson, Austin Riley, Ronald Acuna, Sean Murphy. You have, on the Mets side, Alonso, McNeil, Lindor, going through all these big names, Justin Verlander, Max Scherzer, Kodai Senga, Max Fried, Spencer Strider, Charlie Morton, Kyle Wright. And the show ends with a Bryce Montes de Oca note. It was pretty funny that is where we ended up drawing a conclusion, but it was just to say that he really believes that Montes de Oca could be a nasty reliever for the Mets, a guy that can touch 102, has the good slider. It's the combination that works in the game, but can he avoid the walks that really hurt some of those big swing and miss relievers where, it's great that they can strike out the world, but they walk the world too. How much does it really get you? Beyond Montes de Oca, Steven Nogosek is a very interesting name who has a ton to prove. You know why? He's out of options. So, in a lot of ways, it's almost similar to Zach Green. I mean, these are guys that really have an inside track just based on the lack of flexibility that they bring when it comes to a roster perspective. If you want to keep a Zach Green, a Nogosek, these are guys that you need to hang on to and put in your bullpen. Nogosek did show some promise last year. He had a string of success. Can he replicate that? Can he be lights out in spring? Can he grab one of these bullpen spots? The last name to mention, Steven Ridings, guy that's been hurt for the Yankees the last couple of years, but when he was on the mound, even at the big league level in a very small sample size, he was effective. Big dude. I think he's 6'8", if I'm not mistaken. So a massive guy, a big fastball that'll jump on hitters. What does he look like in camp? Is he a guy that can shock us and grab a job here? I mean, when you add in the non-roster guys, when you add in the guys in the 40, you might have up to 15 competing for 2 spots in the bullpen, maybe 3. The third spot only being if they don't go with a long man coming from that last group we were discussing. The McGills, Lucchese's, Peterson, Budo, Hernandez. If they don't grab one of those guys to put in the back of the bullpen, maybe you have 3 spots available for these relievers, but that's not a lot. And so that open competition is always really sort of the biggest one throughout camp. And you also have a limited amount of time to see these guys. So I think it's good that the Mets have some of their relievers getting that World Baseball Classic action, because it just frees up some Grapefruit League innings for some of these other guys to prove themselves. And your key relievers, because a lot of those guys, we're talking Raley, Ottavino, and Diaz. I mean, these are 3 of your top 4 relievers. At least they're pitching in an environment that is conducive to get ready for the season, I think. If you're looking at relief pitchers pitching the World Baseball Classic, it's pretty awesome. The only thing you worry about is high stress innings when they're still ramping up. But these guys have some time to prepare, and I think you'll see the best of them, not only in the tournament, but early on in the season coming off that experience. So a lot of players with a lot to prove. Spring training is here. Tomorrow's show, I'll be joined by Jay Horowitz. So that is going to be exciting. If you're a Mets fan, you know who Jay is. He has been the PR guy forever. Now he is working on his own podcast. I believe it's titled Amazing Memories. And I will, of course, get that right tomorrow for sure when I have Jay on. We'll talk all about his time with the Mets, his new show, and some great stories about some of the players of the past. So the perfect Throwback Thursday guest and podcast. Make sure you tune into that. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show, at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On MLB Prospects, hosted by Lindsey Crosby. Locked On MLB Prospects is where you want to go to learn about the stars of tomorrow. Follow Locked On MLB Prospects on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get podcasts.